the state of integrating my research has still looks promising, but is also in a critical junction, forcing me to retrace and review things in Metagram that I haven't looked at for over 5 years. So see, like I knew that when I that's also why I invented new terminology inside of Metagram, because I knew that I was dealing with structures that I didn't actually have a firm basis for modeling. And I knew that the biggest problem is that I wanted to have some kind of shared pattern between the three gunas. And I wasn't sure if, in kind of trying to conflate the underlying structure between the three gunas, was legitimate or not. Because I could tell that they shared something, but then they also used it differently. So, and it could be that each guna is so unique that therefore the terminology that I made up, that I made them share, that is not that whole structure that I made that they shared. I don't think it's necessary that they had to share that particular structure, and that's the structure that describes the things like, let me get a list somewhere. But I mean, this is why I made up this jargon of what I called the answer, the prayer, the declaration. Let me just find it. I don't think it's in this document. Sorry, I'm just trying to find it so I can read it out in the right. Oh no, I can just read it here. The devotion, the declaration, the answer, the prayer, the worship, and the oath. And I'm trying to retrace. So I mean, it doesn't really matter, because that jargon that jargon that I invented, the devotion, the declaration, the answer, the prayer, the worship, and the oath, I tried to correlate it to things, and I correlated it to the 12 model itself. So basically, it's like, so the idea was that the 12 model itself, which is made up of the three different gunas, could be, I'm not even unsure about this because I can't even remember. But the thing is that it is convoluted, and I do need to retrace it. But essentially, the reason why I need to retrace it is not because that structure is not set in stone, and it is a metaphor, and it is a metaphor now that I can root into metagram. Sorry, that I can root into metatype. That metatype is actually what should have provided that structure. So I need to find how that metaphor can be related to now the structure in metatype that I have, to see if it can work. But it is very, very complicated, because I'm trying to work out the ordering itself of the. How did I get the theory that the gunas had a particular order? Oh well, I mean that's because each guna, in some sense, is like a continuing pattern, and the one fits inside of the other, fits inside of the other, which means that if you start in the one, then it kind of, and that's why, for example, sattva is, let's say, more privileged than the other gunas, because sattva actually starts. Sattva corresponds to the sattva guna, corresponds to this metaphor of, the declaration, the devotion, the answer, the prayer, the worship, and the oath, which are the six component parts of the emotional tone circuitry of a false ego complex, which is Now my current thinking is that those are like the isotopes of three particular features. Oh my word. This number might also be wrong. So, I've said 4 and I've said 3. I mean, I'm trying to decipher my own metagram notes because I've got these tables here. And what is just confusing to me is that when I look at these tables, some types have just got 3 emotional tones, and some types have, or there are 3 sections of emotion. Or there are 3. The reason why I'm getting mixed up on this 3 is because one of the columns of one of these 3 elements, some of the types have got 2 emotional tones, and some of them have got 2 in the alternative or 2 combined. So it's like there are 3 types of circuitry. One is that the one, some people just have 1 emotional tone, so then they have a total of 3 distinct ones. Others have got 4 emotional tones, but 2 of them go into 1 slot only. So sometimes people have a particular thing, and that particular thing has more than 1 emotional tone, either in the alternative or that it's like a double-barreled. But either way, it seems that there are 3 component parts, and I don't even reconcile how the 3 component parts make up the emotional tone circuitry in a false ego complex, because when I look at the false ego complex, like if I just find the example one of my own type, let me see, not even familiar with. I should have printed out all the metagram types. It would have been so much easier studying these things, because then I could compare types and have tangible examples. Never wanted to do that horrible clerical work. Okay, it's not enough. Okay, this is it. Okay. Okay, so it's got cautious, annoyed and confused, which is like a double-barreled one, and then it's got angry, cautious, annoyed and confused, and then angry, and then it's angry again. And then it's annoyed and confused again. And then it's cautious. So it starts off with cautious and it ends with cautious. Okay, and what it starts off with is... First angry 8, first angry 8. There we go, okay. So the devotion and the declaration are both the same thing. The answer and the prayer are both the same thing. And the worship and the oath are both the same thing. So there are only 3 items, and then there are 6 objects. Okay, that actually lines up with something that I had already revised, because essentially I was positing that, oh look, there are 4 objects within the metagram structure that I came up with that have two different valences, but then I end up revising that there are only three, because the subconscious, in the parent function of the subconscious is the same parent function in the ego, in the ego. Is also the parent function in the ego, so it doesn't change. They're both the parent function. But it is true that they take on a different valence. That they are. It is a duplication, but it has a different quality to it, as it were, or it has a second life. It has actually a distinct identity, but it is in the same slot. So I think that, yeah, anyway, so I mean that is an important feature in terms of interpreting the structure that I render. But essentially, then there are only three important pivotal things that change, that the ego function changes. The ego function changes. I'm just doing this from memory. I don't think I'll get anything wrong, but that the child function in the subconscious is the hero function in the ego. The parent function in the subconscious is the parent function in the ego, so that stays the same. And then the parent function in the superego is the child function in the ego, and the parent function in the subconscious is the inferior function in the ego. So I think that the devotion and declaration, the answer and prayer, and the worship and the oath, because those are all the same emotional tone, the emotional tone depending on where it is in the sequence of what was the last emotional tone and what is the next emotional tone, it's the sequence of the emotional tone that tells you what sort of isotope state or what level of disintegration or integration the ego function is in terms of if it's sort of waxing or waning into facilitating like a sequitur drama that tells the ego, or you see, the state of coherence or the state of structure, the health of the structure, cannot be gauged in terms of where you are in the sequence of the emotional tone. It has to do, let's say, with the drama that is being portrayed through the style. Like the emotional tone is just the style, it's just the medium, it isn't the message. The actual message would actually be the content that is drawn, that is written in that emotional tone. So the sequence of the emotional tone even isn't, it's the internal substance that is actually in some kind of state, but also perhaps. So, in some sense, the health or the clarity of some of the emotional tones. Okay, now I'm contradicting myself. I guess this is more speculation. That perhaps, depending. So, you've got an emotional circuit. You've got a circuit of emotional tones. And perhaps there's almost like, perhaps not necessarily, but perhaps there is a zero sum. Perhaps ordinarily the lowest common denominator is that there's some kind of zero sum parasitism between the sequence of the emotional tones, that the clarity of some emotional tones will be at the expense or the dissonance or the pressure of other emotional tones, or there will be a very sort of, there'll be an internal feedback, and that internal feedback essentially cannot it's not going to, the only way to see that internal feedback is if you analyze the emotional tones, if you break them down into their cognitive functions. So essentially, if you decompose the emotional tones into their cognitive function definitional components and then relate them back to looking at almost philosophically or metaphysically how those functions are, because even an emotional tone is essentially inside of itself, it is a slanting, it is an interpretation of grammar that is premised in skewing or filtering or emphasizing and de-emphasizing certain cognitive functions, or subordinating. It's premised in either subordinating or privileging cognitive functions in contrast to one another, in respect of one another, relative to other cognitive functions. And so that can have a kind of a universal metaphysical, you can kind of decompose them into those elements, and then you can kind of work out certain themes perhaps, or work out certain issues. Anyway, that's tangential, but so there's a hidden story about the actual objective impact on independently that you can write about, or that you can analyze in terms of the impact on cognitive functions as one of the 12 cognitive functions which are represented by the 12 model. And those 12 cognitive functions are actually distinct things, but just to help things out and make them a bit easier, I gave them Jungian cognitive function labels. And just out of interest, there are two introverted intuitions. There are two. Let me try to think. There are two extroverted feelings. There are two introverted sensings. And there are two extroverted sensings. And that's how you go from 8 to 12. But anyway, okay, let me just continue. So if the devotion and the declaration are the same, that means that actually makes good sense, because then those are the, then there's something about the state of those emotional tones. So in some sense, does that mean that they could be in two places at once? That means any emotional tone could signify two places in the circuitry. So they can only know themselves in relation to a particular ordering or a particular sequencing of how they in terms of the flow of the emotional tone. The actual sequence of the emotional tone is the only way to know where you are in the metatype model of which side of the mind are you in. Are you in the superego? Are you in... And essentially, then, if you are fixed in one side of the mind, it is going to somewhat be because of a particular context of not being able to move over into the preceding sequence of emotional tone, or also that something about the prior emotional tone that precedes being in the emotional tone is as a kind of command value perhaps, or is that maybe being able to play with these emotional tones to the extent to which that you can just teleport from any interlocking mood to any other interlocking mood is the way that you kind of gain mastery over the false ego. that you're no longer trapped by the sequencing of these emotional tones, would maybe be the signifying mark of self-actualization or independence of the false ego complex. Okay, but anyway, okay, so if the devotion and the declaration are the same, and the answer and the prayer are the same, and the worship and the oath are the same emotional tone, so each of these is represented 3 times, but then essentially what makes someone a particular metagram type is that the particular grammar in their mind has evolved a habitual pattern and signature of thought and sequence, which ingrains them, or which is like a circular argument, and so that they are trapped in that recurring drama, as it were. But what they are in fact doing is, as they are cycling through that drama, is they are trying to, within that internal drama, create a picture that is stable enough to allow for the adult, or the ego, to allow the ego to properly subordinate the superego and the subconscious, which will give it enough independence to allow the unconscious to develop, and then as the unconscious develops, it will also unbridle the independence of the superego. Because at the same time that the unconscious is independent, similarly, the superego starts generating a kind of independent life of its own. And I think that is generally what is even what happens to very young children that develop cluster B personality disorder type structures, is because it's very uncomfortable to develop the unconscious, but the more that the unconscious develops, the more that the superego becomes an independent thing, which usually is prevented from happening because ontologically the superego starts off half undeveloped, and it usually only gets developed by the unconscious side of the mind. But in, let's say, pathological or traumatic environments, the ego itself gets a kind of precocious steroid infused jumpstart, and it has not been buttressed properly from the subconscious, which never got a chance to naturally develop from so it has weak resources. The ego doesn't have strong resources to take from the subconscious, because usually the subconscious, anyway, I'm not, I don't want to talk about this now. I was going to make a recording talking about some refinements that I had on the metatype structuring, which I'm still going to have to make a recording, but this is just too compelling to work out what the integration of all this stuff is. Back to metagram. So I haven't thought about this yet, and it'll probably be a little bit of trial and error, but I'm just trying to work out. So if I'm correct, that sattva is the clearest because it maps the ontological thing. Let's see. So the sattva, this is the sattva that even as I read this in my notes, it says rajas, because I've only changed that recently. So the formula that I have here is that the superego, and I'm renaming these things because this is not what it's written here, but now this is what I call it nowadays, that the superego that starts with the death is the worship. So that means that the worship and the oath, then, if I'm correct, is the the worship and the oath is the prime false prophet. So that means that, so if the death is the worship, so I don't know which one is which. Maybe the worship is the so I don't know which one is represented in the ego. So the child function of the ego is either the worship, and then the oath is when it's in the superego, as the parent function. Yeah, because the parent function of the superego is the child in the ego function. So I'm not sure which one is which. I'll have to give that some thought. But I mean, this is the death, which is a perception. So that would lead me to believe that it's the worship is the so I don't even know if I can do it like that. That might not even be what it turns on, but let me think. I'm just trying to think what did I used to say? Is the child function? No, those don't have perceptual judgments. Because my model of metatype breaks that MBTI sort of thing. But anyway, no, my word. So if I say that the worship is death, so I don't even know, because my thing is metaphorical, so they might not even correlate to a feature like this, or that feature might not have any fidelity to track it on. But damn, I can't even find the sequence. I think that's in my other notes, but I think it goes. So the weird thing is that, oh, here it is. No, this is the ideal. That doesn't work. Oh, here we go. It goes worship, declaration, answer, prayer, devotion, oath. So it goes first worship, then declaration, then answer, then prayer, then devotion, then oath. Well, maybe it would make sense that the oath would be if sattva is the clearest and oath is the last one, then, and if it is ontological, then the worship would be the parent function of the superego, and the oath would be the child function of the ego. And so so that what makes sattva a more rational type in some sense, or a more transparent type, a more golden type, is that their emotional tone stack is more sequitur, is the most sequitur sequence, whereas other people's stacking of their emotional tones is kind of hodgepodge and forces them to, their ego is synthesized in such a way with circuitry that plods them into because in some sense what the emotional tone is in fact doing is it's conditioning the underlying metatype dimension of psychological reality into conforming to the thought, habit, and pattern and signature that amounts to the integrated drama that is what's the word, that is being orchestrated by the man, what was the thing that I used to say? It came off the tongue so nicely. The collaborative structure that is the ego, that the ego is the configuration of of an integration between the superego and the so the emotional tone stuff is in some sense the backstory of the ego. It doesn't even relate to the unconscious. So as soon as you start dealing in the unconscious, you're actually in a side of the mind which is in some sense it's a bit like a solvent. It dissolves the emotional tone stack to some degree. It like undermines it almost from the outside. Or it perhaps it could be described as thematically toying with the subcomponents of the emotional tones, that essentially you could look at from a metatype perspective the contents of the unconscious side of the mind and realize how destabilizing it is, not to the ego synthesis, you could say, not to the emotional tone circuitry, but in how it shades the emotional tones, how it adds layers of um, extraneous deluge onto the emotional tones, which makes the emotional tone drama, which the ego is dependent on, um, it makes it uh, sort of epistemologically dubious in some existentially threatening sense, in that it deflates the value of the dream that the ego requires, which is essentially its command over the superego and the unconscious. And in some sense, what the unconscious is also doing is then, as a secondary thing, notice that the unconscious is doing this directly, but the superego, especially the hero function and the inferior function in the superego, which will start to generate. Actually, my theory is that the unconscious will have a pollution effect on the inferior function in the ego, and then the inferior function in the ego is the child function in the superego, and the child function in the superego begins as zero. It begins as pure implication. It starts its life as a virginal force. It doesn't have anything. So there's nothing for the parent to do but to the parent of the superego is just there as a stepping stone to develop the subconscious and for the exploration of the subconscious. And then as the ego starts to develop, especially in conjunction with the pressure given to it by the unconscious side of the mind, the inferior function starts to be activated, and the inferior function in the ego charges up the child function in the superego. And once the child function in the superego starts developing, then suddenly the hero function and the inferior function in the superego also awaken, and now you've got a wild animal in let loose in the nice zoo that was being administered and managed by the ego function. So you started off with empty cages. You inherited a zoo. The ego built the zoo, but it had no wild animals. But then after it's got the show up and running, it's imported these animals um, from the benefactor, the unconscious, and now it's got it, it's got this local problem. Anyway, weird analogy. So, but the hero and the inferior function only happen after in the superego, only happen in sympathy with the child function. Um, and essentially, this the reason why I say it that way is because obviously the reason why the hero function and the inferior function even, I mean, obviously it's because the parent function then has to step in between the hero and the child. And that will create direct dissonance with the ego function, because now you've just messed with now you're forcing the ego function's child function to become a parent function to the superego, because the hero and the inferior function, the superego, have been um, activated because of that parent function as well. So the parent function has got the side hustle, or the child function, the ego, then develops this whole side drama, which takes it out of the ego. I want to say the ego, man, I need to come up with better words. Let me say the ego synthesis formula or integration formula, which is the emotional tones. And to some degree, so all I have done in Metagram is that I have tracked three objects. One object from, it's actually two objects from the superego, and one object from the subconscious, in how they are present in the ego. So two objects from the superego and one object from the subconscious. No, that's not right. Oh, well, I mean, it is actually two objects also from the subconscious, but I forget the one because it's doing the same role in both. Um, in some sense, you could say that that parent function that is performing the same in both could be metaphorically said to be that the emotional tone sequence itself is a representation of the kind of the strange dichotomy of that thing. So yeah, there are metatype perspectives and lenses which might be worth tracking and, let's say, extracting, you know, as kind of as and just stuck around. So when you're looking at the metatype, sorry, if you're looking at the metatype, or yeah, if you're looking at the metatype model of a particular type, and you're looking at their metagram emotional tones, it might be worth just sticking out that uh, um, underlining that parent function as being like a kind of as being almost like one of the bystanding, oh, man, how to say this, that is associated with almost two sets of yeah, okay, so how about this, yeah, so that half of the, whichever one of these objects refers to the ego function, the devotion, the answer, the worship, or the declaration, the prayer, and the oath, whichever three of those corresponds to the ego function valence, is going to have a particular kind of parent function in the ego that it is associated with, and then that same function is also in the subconscious, and that is associated with only one of those three. But essentially, that you can understand, I mean, this is a small qualification, but this is an added layer of, let's say, interpretation that would be worth adding to the metagram and the metatype modeling, that essentially these three functions function in conjunction with a particular isotope, let's just say, of of that parent function, and then this other emotional tone is functioning in concert with also another parent function, which is the same function but has a kind of split personality. So there's a kind of 3-1 divide in terms of a major split personality. Um, anyway, so there is a split personality in a background function that can be linked very clearly to now, which now that was the point of having metatype and metagram, is being able to make these interesting cross-pollination interpretations um, of what's going on to get added layers of specificity and detail of cognitive or insight into people's cognition. Anyway, and then there's another side story which is too complicated to talk about the super ego, which has to do with also, you could call that the kind of, so once I've located which one of these terminologies things are linked to which one of these things, I can also start to say, well, that emotional tone combined with this metatype cognitive function, or actually these combinations of metatype cognitive functions that relate to someone's superego and how they are linked to the ego, or how they, that these emotional tones are the ones in this person's type that are getting bogged down and sequestered by by these mechanisms of sort of the independent features that disintegrate the ego formulation, or that act against the ego formulation, or antagonize and unsettle it. The biggest asymmetry, that is the weirdest thing, is just essentially how I don't want to make those general comments. It's going to convolute talking about this. That can come later. Yeah, I was just going to talk about the subconscious and how essentially the subconscious can never get away from the fact that the ego deals with it in a much heavy-handed way relative to the superego. That the ego function is dealing with the superego with kind of kid gloves, and it is much more heavy-handed against the subconscious. It really takes advantage of the subconscious, and the subconscious really doesn't like how the differential treatment, because it is, it's the subconscious's child has to become the ego function's hero. I mean, it's, and while its parent function stands by and adopts the subconscious's, the superego's parent as its child. So the subconscious is being forced to have its parent function treat another child. So the subconscious's parent has to treat the superego's child as its child, and the subconscious's child becomes the hero. Um, but it's also, is also kind of not true to some degree, because when it's the hero, it's not. It also takes on a different valence. It's like another duplicate. It's not the same function. It's like it's a it's an alternative. It's like a re-established, rehashed um, premise. So it's like a separate entity. It's like a new entity. So there's a duplication of that cognitive function. But anyway, that tension will still be felt, perhaps, by the subconscious. And so the subconscious is anyway. So man, I don't. I have to say all these things, and it's embarrassing, but the metaphor that I create, metagram, might have to be completely reworked from the ground up. It might be that these things do not correspond, in which case I have to, because I mean, like, look, how I originally constructed metagram with these six objects that I try to standardize between them. I knew that standardizing them between the gunas was was an invention. That was just like a fiction because I wanted to make it sort of as universal as possible, and I already knew that when I was kind of conflating them, the reason also why I wanted to do it was because I wanted to use the same language. I didn't want to invent sort of extraneous language, and I thought that it should be standardized, and I also thought that there was something universal about them, but I didn't have recourse to that structure, and I wanted to create something that was elaborate enough, but not elaborate enough that would. I, I, I mean, this is going to sound like I'm just saying this now, but this is honestly when I was doing Metagram, and I told myself that what I told myself when I was doing this part of the theory is I said, I don't have the data available to even know what I'm talking about, but I need a metaphor that is not overly. It needs to be complicated enough to map enough differences, but um, and so I invented this idea that it would be rooted within the 12 model itself. But I knew that that was basically a fiction, but I thought that referencing it to that model also made it universal. It also made it so that each guna could share the same internal terminology. And I knew that I believed that they should share the same terminology, that somehow the metaphor would share some notion, and the only thing that I had to root it to was the 12 model, which is essentially at least the collection of all the compositional elements of the emotional tones themselves. But that was really a shot in the dark to say that the collection of all the emotional tones in a kind of in a system was the basis for why there were very particular patterns of why people seem to have different orderings. I mean, even after I derive my metaphor, there is not there's not really a good justification with why. I mean, after I create all of these terminologies, of devotion, declaration, answer, prayer, that doesn't explain why one guna starts off as that one guna starts off as devotion, and another guna. It goes from devotion to oath to worship to declaration to answer to prayer. That's the rajas, formerly named sattva, but now I call it rajas. So the rajas starts off with devotion. The sattva starts off with worship. It's the same sequence, but they start at different places. And tamas starts off with answer. And that still might just be a kind of, maybe that metaphor is even wrong, that it has this particular ordering. But you see, that is one of the strongest features, I think, of the system, because that was empirically discerned. That wasn't theoretically derived. That was built into the development of the data. The first thing that was discovered was essentially was the emotional tones, was the only thing that was empirically discovered, and then I theoretically grounded them in models, and then they had more than one emotional tone. People had more than one emotional tone, and finding the links between them, finding how those emotional tones connected with one another was one thing, and then aggregating all of those connections and then trying to work out a general rubric of the patterns, the abstract patterns between that, the regularities, and then that discovered the subtypes of the gunas. Not exactly in that order, because I already had essentially the gunas in some form, because people had different emotional tones and they had different sets of emotional tones. But what's weird is it's only the devotion and the declaration that has more than one emotional tone. So there is an asymmetry within that. That devotions and declarations have two emotional tones, while the answer in the prayer only ever has one. And the worship and the oath also can have two. That's just Thomas that has that. No. Sattva also has. So I misspoke earlier when I said that one of them has got two things. It's two of them has two things, but it is different because the devotion and the declaration is by far the most complicated, because you get two types. You get the double-barreled ones, and you get the either-or ones. And then the worship and the oath has a confusion in that they just have or. They don't have double-barreled ones. They just have one or the other. So all of that is asymmetrical. which would give particular clues and perhaps and hopefully confirmation as to what metagram elements they should correspond to. So if I've already said that, for example, if the worship or the oath is the child function and the ego, and the parent function and the super ego, then could it be that the one in the ones that have or in, if the one goes into the one and the other goes into the other, that would also make sense how those types could end up having two completely distinct senses of self, because if the child function in the superego can have two different emotional tones in some sense, and especially in sattva, formerly called rajas, if that is the very first emotional tone in the circuit that initiates the circuit, then in some sense you could say that there are two independent circuits. There's one that at its core has the one emotional tone, and there's one that at its core has the other one. And there's sort of two possibilities. It could be that certain people that have this particular type only ever develop one circuit, and the other one is always just maybe a possibility, but that is never actually developed. Hmm. Yeah, well, that's an aspect of metagram that I was hoping to. That sadly might also be a complexity that is just always somewhat a bit nebulous, but it might also be associated at least with certain symptoms of pathological, psychological manifestations. That could also mean that there's dissonance. Also, that it might be more that type would be more prone to having an independent superego because of the split in the emotional tone, that the ego and the superego could both function simultaneously, perhaps, and therefore also at odds with one another, because the ego could be integrating only one of those emotional tones and not both simultaneously, perhaps. There might be things like that. Anyway, I haven't thought about that too much. And also, as these emotional tones are actually sequentially occurring in cognition, or being stimulated in one's cognition, thematically perhaps, through other content, or that is guiding the framing of content, the kind of the grammatical backdrop, the context of cognition, essentially. So the emotional tone is like the tone of thinking. So it is like the contextual component in in active contemplation. Let's see the other. There are other types that have two emotional tones in their, not in the not in that section of their ego, but in the sorry, not in the superego child function, but in the devotion declaration, which I'm still not sure what that is. Maybe I shouldn't maybe just guess. Well, let's see. It's one of two things. It's either the child function in the superego. So it's either the child function in the superego has two valences, or it's the subconscious child that becomes the hero. I'm leaning towards the subconscious, but that's just a blind guess at this point. But if it is the subconscious, it's interesting. All the ones, okay, that have two of those that are alternative, that are or one or the other. Let's see, if it is the ego function, that means that essentially they have two ego functions, or at least the possibility of two hero functions in the ego. They have two moods of their ego function. And all the people that have that, all the people that have an alternative in that, do not have an alternative in their child function of their superego. So that complexity is removed. But it's interesting that everyone who has two possibilities in their child function of their ego, of their superego, also has two emotional tones in, if I'm speculating currently correctly, in their ego, hero function. But those two emotional tones are not alternative. They are and. It's one and the other. It's not. But it's not one or the other. It's both. So they have a double-barreled. Everyone who has an alternative as their superego child function has essentially got a double-barreled uh, hero function in their ego. So that's always been weird for me, because I'm not sure if that double-barreled thing is a consequence. It could be I mean, because it only exists. So maybe that's why there's a double image in the child function, because the one is responsible for producing the complexity in that process, in that later process. And then what happens is, so that later process is complex, and it requires, let's say, two source images. That does actually make sense, because to be worried or cautious, I would think that to be annoyed and confused. So you are worried or cautious to then be annoyed and confused. Well, to be worried or to be cautious could both lead to confusion, but it could both lead to being annoyed, I guess. Actually, maybe that isn't then. Yeah, that's not. Who knows? That is weird. They both have the same signature. Oh, yeah, but they have the same signature from a different gunner. Oh, wait, this was something that I never thought about. That maybe that these are actually two types. Yeah, I still needed to work that out to confirm the MBTI correlation, because I really got the impression when I was growing up at a very young age, when I was monitoring the development of my own false ego complex, that I could have been an ENTJ as much as I could have been an INTJ. And it might be, I mean, I've always thought myself to be very similar to Christopher Hitchens, apart from him being an ENTJ and me being an INTJ. But I thought that we had very similar personality styles otherwise, and I always wanted to work out if he was. There are three different metatypes that correspond to my metatype, and one of them is called, I think, something an annoying. Like I'm the first my INTJ metagram type. I call the first angry eight, and let me find. So I should actually research that. That should be the next thing that I research, and to work out if he is a. Oh no. I thought that there was also an annoyed. No, there isn't. There's the first anxious two and the first lonely four. It definitely doesn't sound like him. So that'll be interesting if maybe Christopher Hitchens, maybe he is the confused version or the annoyed version. I feel like I might be the annoyed version and he might be the confused version. Maybe, if that is. But I already said it was double barreled, so that doesn't make sense. I mean, when I had these thoughts that I could be an ENTJ, I was 4 years old, so that might have been before my emotional tones had even started to coalesce, so that might have been sort of very primordial in my psyche at that point to be able to. Yeah, that's probably a. Don't know what to do. But if anything, it would be the difference in being worried or cautious. That perhaps being worried makes me an INTJ, and Christopher Hitchens was cautious, making him an ENTJ. In our in the different flavor of our superego child function, which then becomes the superego parent function, which then becomes the ego's child function. And that I am worried and he is cautious. That might be it. That would also be very interesting, because then I have extra layers to put onto the emotional tones now. I can link them to specific metatype functions, which would, yeah, so that will be the next thing, because that will give that will give layers of specificity, which will either make it very clear that it's onto something, or and that it describes people much more deeply than other typologies or not. It might also make psychometry a lot more detailed